Wow, Professor Vali Nasr, it is such an honor and pleasure to have you on the Fabrice Guerrier Show, where we're going to explore the future and your ideas and your experience. I've introduced you in the beginning of the podcast, so without further ado, I would love to just dive right in.
Sure.
How did you discover your passion? Tell us a little bit about your journey.
Sure. So first of all, thank you for inviting me to this podcast. It's really great to be joining you. Uh, I'm by origin Iranian. So I was born in Iran. I was just about the age to go to college when the Iranian Revolution of 1979 happened.
Mm,
So my family left Iran. We settled in the United States. In today's parlance, you could say we were refugees, exiles, refugees, involuntary people who involuntarily came and their lives were completely disrupted. So everything I knew about my childhood, my future, my relationships, extended family, etc., was basically cut within a 2-week period, and I didn't go back to Iran for decades after that. So that in many ways was traumatic. I was a student in the United States when the hostage crisis happened, when there was a lot of focus on Iran, and also particularly because the revolution in Iran in 1979 was an Islamic revolution, so it brought into Middle East politics this whole question of Islam's role in politics, which was very unique to at that point in time in the world, which was by and large everywhere was secular. I mean, nowadays we also have religion in America, in Israel, in India, basically taking a bigger claim in politics. But then Iran was unique. So in school, I became increasingly, focused on finding answers to this. And then as I went to graduate school, went for my PhD, the questions I tried to answer was about how does Islam become involved in politics? What does it say in politics? How does politics change Islam? And I worked for a number of years on Pakistan. I worked on general questions about Islam and politics. And then more recently, I've been much more focused on Iran. And as that country still is grappling with the consequences of that revolution, that since the revolution happened, its relationship with the United States has become more and more fraught, more and more confrontational. Its politics looks and its international profile looks to be one of a kind. There's no other country is as separate from the United States or as at odds, defiant of the international order. And even last year, we saw major uprisings in Iran by the people protesting, in fact, the regime that they helped bring to power some 4 decades ago. So these are the sort of sets of issues that interest me, and in a way, everything that happened in Iran, which changed my life, also changed the Middle East because of role of Islam, role of Iran. And that's still ongoing. I mean, this region has gone through many decades of tumult, war, terrorism, and the like. And so I've been following that journey.
Wow, that's incredible. I've been reading a lot of statistics here, especially in the West, like in Europe and also in the United States, how religion is increasingly playing less of a role in the day-to-day lives of people. And the sort of impact of religion really is the idea of bringing groups of people together in community to do certain actions. And it feels like the idea that religion plays a much more intense and more integrated role in the Middle East. Like, what does that mean for you? Like, because I think like a lot of people, I would say in the US or maybe in Europe, might not necessarily understand what does that look like when religion is so like integrated to sort of the life and the morale and the vision and the aspiration. Like, what does that mean, and how, and do you think, what's your sort of intuition? Do you think that's created and strengthened sort of communities, or has this created more sort of polarization within people in the Middle East?
I mean, not every country is the same. I would say what happened, the way in which religion plays in the Middle East, of course, it's culturally very different. What Islam says is very different from Christianity. But the way, it's not that different from the United States. Because if you went to very religious parts of the United States in the Deep South, people believe that the religion ought to be lived. They all go to church. If there's kind of like even peer pressure on people to go to church, you can't be part of the community if you're not part of the church. But what happened in the United States, at least in my lifetime in the United States, is that increasingly the observation of boundary line between religion and the public sphere has eroded. So that's the idea of separation of church and state, not only in terms of, you know, the church does its own money and the state does its own money, but in the sense that when I came to America, at least on the East Coast, or majority of what I saw in America, it was understood that yes, the Bible may say this and that about choice, about abortion, about prayer, etc., but that remains outside of the public sphere. That there is no claim by the public sphere by religion to the public sphere. So in the Muslim world, one level of thinking about it is that groups like the ones that carried out the revolution, or Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, or Islamic forces in North Africa and Pakistan, basically believe that God's law must be lived by. God didn't send religion for it to be ignored, and then you live in accordance to secular law. And so they began to push for society and politics to reflect religious values, which is not very different than the debates we have in the United States.
Yes, you're
right. So or like, let's say in Israel today, about the fact that, you know, rules and laws of Judaism as interpreted by Orthodox Jews must be observed, because religion cannot be separated from public space. The other level of it, which is unique to the Muslim world, I don't see that in the West, is that Islam's role in politics was not about taking individuals to heaven. It was about providing a solution to sort of big political issues. So if you even thought about a group like Al-Qaeda, it's not saying that Al-Qaeda exists in order to help Muslims attain spirituality. Al-Qaeda exists to change the balance of power between Muslims and America. It's about, it's a kind of a fight that, again, in the West we're familiar with, which is between people who are underdog, who fight what they think is an oppressive order, right? They believe there's capitalism, or there's white supremacy, or there is, this and that and the other, there's injustice, and they organize to fight. And sometimes they do it, peacefully, as Dr. Martin Luther King did, but sometimes they also have taken arms, like the Weathermen in the United States in the 60s. So that's the role also that Islam played, which is very unique to it. In other words, Islamic forces became very powerful because they picked up the fight against, fight for justice, fight for power. That the Muslims are losing wars. Israel is taking lands from Palestinians. The Americans are bullying them, or they're doing resources, and the secular governments are no good. And so these Islamic forces, people like Khomeini or bin Laden, step into this space, claiming that religion will do better than secularism. Of course, it's not old school religion. It's not like purity of heart and soul so that you go to heaven. It's religion deployed for fist raised social action
movement.
And so that one is unique to the Middle East, right? That one is unique. Why did Islam become such a big part of the political discussion? Why do so many people get attracted to Islamic political parties? Not just to Islam itself, but to Islamic political parties. Why do European youth pick up and go join ISIS in Syria, right? It has something to do with this promise of these kinds of Islamic groups that they're going to empower them.
Mm.
right? So that is not completely unintelligible for us, right? That dimension, I don't want to say it's all about this,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
there is that powerful dimension there.
Do you feel like, because I'm trying to kind of position myself as like as part of the listener of someone, let's say perhaps that has like preconceived notions, maybe doesn't know like the
Mhm.
spectrum and how like complex Islam is. Like I got to take a class in Islamic mysticism in grad school
Mhm.
with an Iranian scholar. I forgot his name, and I'm sure you probably maybe I'll connect after to tell you. But it seems like why is there such a misunderstanding of Islam like in the West? And do you feel like that misunderstanding has sort of bolstered people's sort of embrace of Islam and for more mass like movement level? Do you think there is a sort of like cultural wars that's happening, or is it?
Yes, yes, there is. Yes, there is. I mean, you said Islamic mysticism. Islamic mysticism is about spirituality. Like it's about essentially experiencing God in a beautiful way through contemplation, which is not very different from Eastern yoga or meditation sometimes, right?
Yeah.
Yes, you do your prayers, Mecca, etc., but it's about cleansing your soul. So it's very much individualized. Whereas Islamism, the one that carried out revolution or is in Al Qaeda or is in that's not, they're not concerned with that,
Mm,
right? They're concerned, as I said, with political issues, with fighting Israel, with fighting America, with fighting injustice, like right against white people in Europe, for instance, right? And the misunderstanding comes, I think, from a couple of things. One is that it's always easier for Americans and Europeans to typecast their enemies
mm,
rather than try to understand them.
mm,
So there's nothing wrong with the way we do things. There's something wrong with them,
mm,
right? Even today, as we're debating, did we see this backlash against, critical race theory? Oh, no,
mm.
no, don't teach them those things. Like we've done anything wrong,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So that attitude existed. No, we didn't have any bad policies. They have no reason to be unhappy. It must be their religion.
Mm,
And because it's an enigmatic religion, because of the way Muslims look, etc. So you would say, yeah, their religion doesn't recognize the boundary between religion and politics, as if our religion now in America, Christianity, it doesn't either. You can go to the U.S. Congress, and half of those congressmen coming from the South don't recognize the boundary between religion and politics either.
mm,
It might as well be ayatollahs, for all practical purposes. But it's much easier to typecast, right? It's much easier to say that there's something genetically, culturally wrong with Muslims, rather than to say that they are lashing out against some perceived, maybe, and some real senses of injustice,
mm,
right? And maybe the Muslims are making a big mistake by sort of mobilizing religion in this way, and it hasn't paid off.
mm,
But the way in which Islam works in politics is much more understandable than we make it out to be,
mm,
right? If you want to understand somebody like Khomeini or Bin Laden, I mean, you look at them and you see they don't sleep and wake up thinking about spirituality. They sleep and wake up thinking about reversing the balance of power with the United States. It's a very secular concern.
mm, mm. Was there a point in your like going to college in the United States, like doing your research, was there like a major turning point in terms of like, I guess I'm intrigued to see like how is your perception being in the US, like in your understanding of Islam and evolve? Like was there different points where you sort of realize a different way of looking at it? Because I feel like in the US there's such a like an intersecting frameworks of like ideas and people from all over the world. And then I can only imagine, like, as you experienced and you left within a week, your roots were ruptured and then you arrived to a new land. It was very similar for me when I moved to the US in 2004.
Mhm.
It's kind of like readjusting your worldview. Like how are you able to stay grounded, but also what were the sort of major shifts intellectually that like occurred in your life?
No, it's a very good question. Largely as probably you're aware of it, when we sit down and become self-reflective, we see that being here has changed us in profound ways, right? Maybe we don't think about it, but sort of your center of gravity intellectually, socially, etc., changes. The way you look at the world changes because you absorb values and ideas from your environment that then changes the way you look at things, right? But at the same time, I have to say that what is wonderful about the United States is that its intellectual environment at universities was very open, right? It was perfectly fine to pursue these ideas and see and try to see social science theories or studies of, let's say, theories that were there about African-American mobilization, political mobilization. How does it apply to what you're seeing? I think one of the tragedies in America is that both from the left and from the right, there's sort of an assault on that in the United States about what the universities can or cannot say or can or cannot do, or what you get taught in the classroom. But at least when I was a graduate student, I sort of absorbed all of that. Not to say that it was identical to Islam, but let's say I remember like reading about Malcolm X, and it was around about the time the movie came out. And I remember as a graduate, much younger, I came out and said, well, yeah, it was great. I'm very happy to learn about him. But I'm reflecting, this sounds so familiar to what I'm reading about Iran and about Egypt and about the way these people think. Let's put aside the Arabic, let's put aside the Quran part.
Yeah.
The discourse is very similar. It's the discourse of brown people, it's the discourse of the underdog to get empowered. Right? Now methodology may be different, but that helped me better understand why is this thing having traction there. Right? And similarly, you could look at other historical events around the world. You could look at theories, and you could apply it back onto what you were seeing in the Muslim world, and then try to explain it in a way that is actually accessible and logical, rather than trying to make it into something that you can just reduce. Well, you can't understand these people. That's just the way they are. It's all in their religion. So we don't need to know anything about it other than knowing that it's their religion.
So that's just fascinating. So you're saying there's sort of we tend, as humans, we tend to codify like, oh, these other people over there, their religion, but there's a sort of universal current that you're tapping into. You're seeing like the universal struggle of humans wanting to have more rights, wanting to have space for their family,
exactly,
to be able to like ascend economically and have the means to be able to find purpose and meaning and sort of practice their beliefs. Like, I'm wondering, like, is this because as someone that's rooted in the West, at least for me, I recognize that I very much have very democratic, like liberal human rights sort of language around how I see progress. And I feel like it's, at least for me as a science fiction writer, kind of thinking about the deep future and how systems could evolve and how it connects with society and mythologies. It's like, how do I disconnect from that sort of symbolic structure of like the Western way of democracy, or the Western way of helping the people, let's say this universal current of people wanting to have more sort of rights? Like, I guess, how does this look in the Islamic world? Like when people, or because it seems like whenever we talk about Egypt, whenever we're talking about Iran, people are automatically going to say, okay, it might look like a dictatorship, or these are sort of the human rights check boxes that are maybe not filling. So like, what does a sort of universal, outside of the word democracy, what does the universal sort of space where people are able to kind of express themselves within that culture look like? Do you feel like, what are some of the trends, or what have you seen?
Well, you know, the differences between countries. Some are a bit more open, some are a bit more closed. But the reality of it is that when we think about democracy as an absolute good in the United States, right? We also think that, first of all, we have it. In other words, it's been functioning. It's been going on. But we also think that we can participate in it to get positive things for yourself. I mean, that was what Martin Luther King believed. Look, let's not go to revolution. If we want our rights as American citizens, when we participate, we can make democracy work for us, right? But what happens if you go to a place like Haiti or like Middle East where there is no democracy, right? So then like big issues like injustice, poverty, oppression, racism, you know, things like this cannot be addressed through democratic means because the institutions are not there, right? But the problems don't go away. In other words, there's something very similar between, you know, when you have like poverty in America or racism in America or the way African Americans now talk about systematic, you know, oppression in the hands of the white evens, and the way, let's say, Middle Easterners thought about centuries of, you know, Western colonialism, right? Now, you may be familiar, I mean, in Haiti, like in a lot of Latin America, a part of the Catholic Church gravitated towards this, the liberation theology tradition.
Yep.
Right? So what liberation theology basically is a form of Catholicism is, again, it's not about piety and going to heaven. It's about carrying out a revolution, right? So it's very much about this world. And where did it come from? Because there was no democracy in Brazil, in Argentina, in Haiti, and yet, you know, you wanted to bring about social change, so they became attracted to Marxist ideas about organizing a revolution, right? Now, if you're standing way back, what you see is priests and you see a church, right? But in reality, you know, so Middle East, you could say, has a lot of social economic problems. It is obsessed with imperialism, maybe more so than Latin America.
What do you mean by it is obsessed with imperialism?
Well, because it went through it much like Latin America or parts of Asia, it went to periods that it was under French and British control. They actually carved out countries, like even Iranians to this day complain about a 1953 military coup that overthrew an elected prime minister. And in that sense, they're very much like Latin Americans or like, you know, Asians, but they just sort of haven't got over it. And they're still in the middle of that. They're still in the middle of that sort of anti-imperialist fight, right? Now, anti-imperialism has very close parallels to demand for racial justice, although that's internal to America. But, you know, it's always about sort of a group of people wanting equality, wanting a seat at the table, wanting to end oppression, economic, political, wanting to reverse an imbalance that history created. Right? That urge is there. It hasn't gone away. There is no democratic means to express it. You can't win elections, right? So it erupts in the form of radicalism. In the 1960s, it was secular leftist radicalism. Then in from Iran set the example, then it became Islamic radicalism.
Wow.
Right? So the function that they play is not very different. The function that Hezbollah plays in poor neighborhoods of Beirut for many years is no different than what liberation theologists are doing in Port-au-Prince. There's no water, there's no electricity, there's nothing. Somebody has to attend to this. Somebody has to speak for these people. There's no parliament. There's no way. There's no political system that can possibly address this.
It's almost as if it's like history will be the judge of us. Like looking in the future generations, looking back in this era, we'll have a bigger picture on what was happening. And it's interesting. I was having a conversation yesterday with a friend, and they work in the education system, and they were talking about like the cancel culture and how the universities in the US, it's becoming like less, like it's becoming illiberal. And I was like very frank with her, and I was like, I appreciate the cancel culture because I think it is a sort of it's a reaction of the younger generation not being able to meet the demands of a democratic process that is not fulfilling sort of the visions of their highest form of justice. It's almost as if that's their form of agency. Their form of agency is, as society is transitioning to this digital revolution, it's almost as if like that's the way that they can speak and act in a radical way. Like the question that I have then, like, you speak of revolution, and I think for me, in my mind, I've always looked at revolution in terms of an artistic, intellectual, creative revolution. But like, what does revolution look like when it's centered in the heart, when it's centered around love, when it's centered around peace? Like, because I totally agree, being from Haiti, it's like there is injustice. And even if we have the sort of democratic structures, there's still intergenerational trauma. There's still that sort of traumatic legacy of the past that feeds systems and how people see each other and the separation. Like what does that look like for the Middle East, where you have this anti-imperialist sort of vision of like, okay, we need to embrace our culture and create a sustainable vision outside of sort of a globalized view, but at the same time, there's ruptures of the past are still going to be there. So like, how does change happen, or how do you see the Middle East? And I know it's like maybe we could pick a specific case study in the country, but I'm intrigued to see like, how do you see change and transformation happening within the context of an increasing global world that we can no longer sort of deny, and also the historical legacies of the past, that reconciliation and dealing with these harms needs to happen internally for something more sustainable to grow?
I mean, the short answer is not easily. I mean, what you said about change in America is that it doesn't matter how technologically advanced we get, how much we do certain things. If you don't address the fundamental issues that's bothering at least a segment of the people, then the system's not working for them. That's why, as you said, they are opting out, whether it's cancel culture or maybe on the far right, they have their own views about why democracy is not working for them, right? So now in the Middle East, we don't even have much of a democracy. In some countries, you have something similar to Haiti. In other countries, you don't have it at all. You have military dictatorships, or you have absolute monarchies, right? Yes, there can be transformation, there can be technological transformation, etc. But fundamentally, the region does not have a political system that can actually resolve, if you would, these major grievances or major issues. So it ends up becoming like tectonic plates that, rub against each other and then periodically erupt, like they did in Morocco. Iran's revolution of 79 was something like that. The Arab Spring of 2011 was something like that. Like, you look at the Arab Spring, you say, oh, they had all of these Arab dictatorships. They were just static. They were sitting there. They were pro-American. There was an elite that was making a lot of money. The majority of the population didn't have jobs. It wasn't seeing anything going anywhere. They felt helpless. So, and then there's no voting. There's no way in which they could express themselves. So then it erupted in terms of protest, or you could say it erupts in the form of revolutionary movements, right? Now, part of the problem in the Middle East is that they haven't worked either. It's not like the Iranian Revolution really did solve Iran's problems, or has brought actually a model of government that can last in terms of what it gives its people, what the people want of it, individual freedoms, economic growth, liberty, liberalism. It doesn't give them those, right? And so it's now locked itself in this perpetual war with America, anti-imperialist war with America, which is not going to go anywhere. Or Al-Qaeda's solution to how it's going to reverse balance of power with the United States, collapsed very quickly. I mean, Al-Qaeda was decimated within a year. The United States became even more involved in the Middle East. Many more states were shattered, and there were wars in Afghanistan, in Iraq, etc. But the region's not better for it, right? So part of the problem in the Middle East is that it hasn't found a way forward. You could say, okay, countries like Korea or Japan in the East, or Malaysia or Thailand, have now they were at the same place as the Middle East at some point. They had coups and revolution and Marxist organizations, etc. You had Vietnam at one point. But eventually they found a sustainable path, right? That for now keeps them going forward. They either eradicated a lot of the grievances that the population may want participation in politics, or they provided avenues for meaningful participation in politics that at least, allows them to do things. So this doesn't exist in the Muslim world.
Wow.
So, we can go to the future. You could see the problems in the Middle East are going to get worse because it's no longer just political problems. There's going to be water problems. There's going to be climate problems. There's migration problems. There's a massive demographic problem in the region. There's too many young people. And you still say that in majority of these countries, there's no actual satisfactory way of addressing these sets of issues.
I really appreciate what you're saying around, like, you're sort of like contextualizing like the climate problems, the generational problems, the sort of rift that we see everywhere around the world. Like, I'm wondering, is there an Islamic democracy, or is that itself a very narrow vision of like kind of framing a sort of Western vision? And I know there are universal aspects of democracy, like you've like really laid out for us. I'm wondering, like, is there a nation state, or even in that context, that's doing it well, that you feel like that we could learn from in terms of what does that look like? Because I feel like I hesitate to say that because I don't want to sort of Western, because I feel like
no, it's a very good question. It's a very good question.
Reference.
It's a very good question, and for a while it was right after 1989 and right after 2011, where you had these sort of democratic openings in the West, in Eastern Europe, and then in the Middle East. This came up a lot. I think the short answer, in my view, no religion in its pure form is compatible with democracy. Really.
Wow.
No, I mean, I put it in this sense that
believe that.
No. I mean it in this sense that religion ultimately is about absolute truth. Democracy is about relative truth, right? So if you really, really believe in Catholicism, Islam, Judaism, it's the word of God, right? It cannot be like you say, God said abortion is illegal. You can't say just because the majority of people said, now it's okay, right? So where does religion and democracy work is when religion accepts a compromise to basically, adapt itself to popular sovereignty. Because in every religion, sovereignty belongs to God. If you believe in God, he's the creator. But in democracy, we believe that sovereignty belongs in the people. The people must speak, right? So religion has to adapt itself, like American Constitution or Israeli democracy or Indian democracy for a long time was not that these religions changed it, they just adapted themselves to that. Now, in the Middle East or the Muslim world, there are some experiments along these lines, but they're not as evolved. Like Turkey, even still might be the case, but at least, let's say, early period under Erdogan from 2000 to 2010, a decade, it was a happy medium. It was a government that was self-described itself as Islamic, but it also had a globalized, open market democracy. And the way it fashioned it is to say, okay, this is the compromise we make. You don't need to have an Islamic state. You don't need to have absolutely. What matters is that individuals have the freedom to be Muslims. That was the Turkish formula. That was the compromise, right? But these are still in the Muslim world are far and in between, right? Yes, now that you have a generation of now Islamic intellectuals who actually talk about, the importance of finding ways to accommodate popular sovereignty in religion and to coexist between, God's word and human will in the political process.
Yeah.
But I can't say that there is example of a country that is functioning on this in a systematic way on an ongoing basis. I mean, the most recent case was that Tunisia, after the Arab Spring, was actually an Islamic democracy in the sense that there was an Islamist party would participate in elections. When he lost elections, it handed over the power to the secular party, etc. But now, because there was too much chaos in the economy, there's too much corruption, etc., there's a strong man, there's a dictator who stepped forward and is basically taking it away. Right?
Yeah.
So I think what the Muslim world needs is practice and longevity.
Wow.
Right? Democracies out of the box are ideas. Democracy has to be practiced. People have to learn it. They have to internalize it. I remember, at least in some theories, the first election doesn't matter in democracy. It's the second and third election. And when you lose, that really matters. Right? That is there a transfer of power? The rule of law matters more than elections. Because even dictators, even Kim Jong-un can have an election. Right? It's the rule of law that matters. So if you thought about broadly about, do you have a system in which you have contested elections, rule of law, and regular transfer of power in the Muslim world? Yeah, there is Pakistan, there is Malaysia, there is Turkey, but none of them has really congealed in a way that you can happily say that this is a good functioning democracy.
The challenge I see is that here we look at it, and I think you use the language of like a society that's more open and a society that's more closed. It's kind of that's the human rights freedom house, like sort of language. I'm a society that's transitioning between more closed to more open doesn't necessarily guarantee that there will be more justice or more stability. Because as you said, there are intergenerational trauma, there is climate crisis, there is a globalized world society that we're moving in, where the movement of ideas and the access to different types of truth is changing our tradition. So like, how do we react? How does the Islamic world react in the context of like, if I'm a senator and I'm like, and I'm funding, let's say, the foreign policy or committee, and we're talking about we need to create more, we need to fund different groups to democratize and have more access to like healthcare or more access to those sustainable ways of being that can perhaps open they're not going to say that overtly, but that can sort of make a country more open. Like that, oftentimes, like for example, in Haiti, I've seen this where it's like you have an NGO, you have an organization that's doing the work, but it's like it seems like we're moving in an era where complexity is becoming the norm, uncertainty is becoming this tapestry for systems. And I appreciate what you're saying of like the idea of learning to be in relationship and practice of these sort of democratic ideas. I guess my question is, if we look in the deep future, let's say 20 years, 30 years, or like, what do you think, what does the Islamic world have to do? And I'm talking in the context of like these deep historical sort of legacy from the Afghanistan war or from the conflict, the Israel-Palestine, which has sort of galvanized a lot of people, which kind of touches at the heart of a lot of people. And it's like, but the paradox is we're becoming more globalized. We're becoming more connected in that way.
Yeah.
But like, what does that future look like? What do we do? How do we react?
Well, it's a good point. And actually, first of all, parts of the Muslim world are probably more integrated into their own regions and into the global world than they are with each other. Like you can look at a country like Malaysia and say is more integrated with Southeast Asia and China and the global economy and Australia and US than it is with the Middle East. Or Turkey for a while was much more integrated with Europe, NATO, etc. Right? So I think partly this is the challenge. This is the real challenge. I mean, one of the ways to think about it is that emphasis on democracy is very important, but equally important and maybe even more important is emphasis on good government. In the end, look, if you don't have rule of law, if you end up with corruption, if whoever wins the election, like in Nigeria, loots the state, right? Or that you are not providing basic services to your population, that they don't see any improvement in their lives, it's very difficult to get them to buy into democracy. I mean, we're seeing that in Iraq. it's probably the only Arab democracy right now.
Mm.
They still are voting. Still, the prime minister is elected, right?
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of young Iraqis are now have a authoritarian nostalgia. Like I was in Iraq, and gradually people saying maybe it was better under Saddam.
It's the same.
Right? Same. So why are they saying that? It's not about oppression or right to vote. It's about the governance part, right? Because the guy might have been a thug. He was a thug. It's not might have been. He was a thug. But the electricity worked then better than it does now. There were more jobs then than there is now. There's some basic services that the population needed, including also security, safety, police, etc., that were better than they are now. So you have to also recognize that whether it's Haitians or it's Egyptians or Iranians or Pakistanis, average people, even average poor people, are rational. Like they look at their lives and they look at the future, and they assess the people up there not because they're God-given or they're a pharaoh or they're a king, but are they doing the job? Are things improving? And so we continuously, our kind of countries are caught in a pendulum. We get fed up with badly managed, corrupt dictators. We swing to democracy. We get fed up with badly managed, corrupt democracies, and we swing back to dictatorships. And the countries are stuck in a loop.
Yes.
And unfortunately, all the West does is give platitudes. Oh, wonderful! Haiti has a great new democratic president, or great, Haiti was a mess. There's now this new general who's going to bring order. But there's no emphasis. There has to be much more investment in governance, and especially the things you mentioned. Which is climate, water, food security, heat. These are sort of sets of new issues that were not there before. And yes, they are global issues that affects us all. But in the end, there is a government somewhere who has to address it for their own people, right? So what happens if Iraq or Haiti runs out of water, right? Who was in charge of that? What happens if half of Niger begins to move into Libya because it's too hot and wants to go to Europe, right? So the emphasis, the necessity of giving people governance, etc., is becoming more important. Islamic forces have failed. Democratic forces have failed. Secular dictators have failed. And we've been too focused on who's secular and who's Islamic, and who's dictatorial and who is democratic. Of course, we would prefer secular Democrats, but we have to also note that areas like the Middle East or Haiti, the largest failure is actually governance. I mean, large numbers of people are not being governed. They're not getting anything. First of all, they're not getting security, which you need as an absolute. You shouldn't come out of your house and be robbed at gunpoint.
I appreciate what you say. I'm juxtaposing this because I'm like, people in the US, especially like younger people or climate activists or African-American activists or trans and non-binary activists, they're gonna say the same thing. They're gonna say like, our leaders have failed us. This sort of bureaucratic routine is not accepting of the diversity and the sort of the vision of what this democratic experiment. Like, I have like one final question.
You're absolutely right. I mean, they're also revolting, except they're not, revolting in the street the way Haitians are doing, but they're revolting in their own ways, as you mentioned.
I have a sense that we're moving towards a world society, and I think that's sort of my science fiction sort of framework. It's like this united planet where because I always say, like, if you look in your room anywhere, it's like you have books from like probably hundreds of different authors from all over the world. Your suit probably is made in Italy, and the water you're drinking is from North Carolina. It's like it's all over the place. Latin America. It's like, but I feel like our vision of like the nation state, our vision of how nations work together is like, it just seems like it's not able to meet the demands of the increasing complexity. And the question I'm going at is, the Islamic world is not only rooted in the Middle East, it's all across the world. It's in the US,
Yeah.
it's in America, it's in Europe, it's in Asia. So like, what does that look like? This sort of transnational like expression of Islam, of the diasporic Islamic people that practice, and they're not necessarily ethnic, but more so religious. Like, what does that mean in terms of like the future and how people are, those dimensions of values are evolving? Because even if the values do evolve, like you're saying, this is a problem of governance. It's like it's
Yeah.
a human problem where or you're effective or you're not effective, and which interests are you
You're
playing?
absolutely right. Well, look, I mean, text is always interpreted in a context. Yes, there is a single word, but the experience of Muslims in Senegal is quite different from Indonesia. They all pray, they all look to Mecca, they all read religious law, but the context for their politics and economies are different. The challenges they face are different. So the Muslim, there is a centrality to Muslim world, just like I would say there is such thing as Christianity, especially if you're non-Christian sitting in the Middle East. You can very easily say that's Christianity. But when you look closer, there's huge amount of cultural and regional and political diversity. So African Muslims are much more integrated also into African issues. And in fact, there are some countries like Nigeria, which are sort of divided right in the middle. But in terms of climate, in terms of water, in terms of local culture, you would say Senegalese, Malayans, Southern Moroccans, Northern Nigerians have a lot more in common than they have with Indonesians or Malays or Filipino Muslims, right? And so we have to recognize that, right? So that's also part of this reality. And as we meet these new sets of challenges, some Muslims are going to be impacted more and in a different way than others, right? So even the issue of climate is going to hit, sub-Saharan Africa much more differently than it will Southeast Asia. The options that are there are different. And so at the same time that there's this convergence, there's also a divergence. And yes, it's important to recognize that Muslims have a cultural identity. They identify with themselves, with each other. They have a sense of religion and history. But it's important not to get lost in that, because end of the day, they're like other people. They have political problems, economic problems, social problems. And they are also integrating into these communities. And sometimes one thing is more priority, sometimes it's another. When Trump was president, for Muslims, the biggest problem was the anti-Muslim attitudes of Trump. And now those same Muslims are basically banding together with Christian conservatives over the abortion issue or over, trans issues. Because, they don't, they understand the racism against Muslims, but now they also have some common ground when it comes to sort of conservative values, right?
Yep.
Now, it's not going to be, it's the same in African-American community. There's some African-Americans for whom these sets of conservative values is more important than race. And for some African-Americans, race is much more important than any other issue. And so just like we see that diversity, and you no longer can easily say, this is going to be Latino politics, or this is going to be Black people's politics, that is true of Muslims as well. Right? And you're right. Also, where they live is very interesting, because Muslims are sort of concentrated, or the heartland is concentrated where the three largest and most important continents meet: Asia, Europe, and Africa. So there's no way to think about a global world order that doesn't run through them.
Absolutely.
And sometimes we've been talking about ideas all along, but geography matters. It's also location. Muslims would have never mattered if they were in southern cone of Latin America or in Oceania.
Yeah. Wow. This has been so like compelling. I feel like we're just kind of scratching the surface on this. I want to
get topic.
I want to get your final thoughts. It's like if there, like in the next 30 years, what is one idea? It could be from our conversation, or it could be from somewhere else, that you think our listeners should be paying attention to, that's you think is going to shape the future of the Islamic world in the Middle East. What is that one idea do you think is the most important thing, if you were to say, that we should pay attention to?
Well, Middle East is at an inflection point. I mean, I'm not going to talk about the whole Muslim world. Why? One is because of these sets of climate, water, etc. The Middle East is running out of water across the board, whether it's Iran, Syria, Turkey, Lebanon. It's also growing more and more hot, particularly around the Persian Gulf area. They may become uninhabitable in the next 20, 30 years. That it has too many people that it has to feed and doesn't have necessarily all of those. And then it has unjust political orders with a lot of poverty, injustice, a lot of angry, unemployed, frustrated young people, right? So these issues are not going to go away. They probably will become much more concentrated, and at some point you will have another tectonic shift causing another eruption. On the other hand, for the first time after several decades, the United States is washing its hands of the Middle East. It sort of doesn't need the oil as much. It wants to focus on China and on Russia, and so that's also changing the way in which Arabs and Iranians and Turks have dealt with each other, because you don't have the United States sitting there with, sort of organizing who gets what or who can do what. So it is possible now to imagine that these countries can find ways to coexist if they have to, not because all of a sudden there's a love fest, but become more pragmatic about that. And that can open some doors about greater regional interaction, which hasn't been there. I mean, if you really thought about it, Middle Eastern countries don't trade with each other that much. Wow. Nothing like European. Why? Because they all export the same things to Europe or to the US. And because many of the big ones, the relations with each other haven't been good. So until very recently, they have not been trading. So some of these things may change, and you may have a different dynamic coming out of this.
Wow. Thank you, like, so much. I appreciate what you're saying, because I feel like I'm getting a little bit of goosebumps, because my generation as a millennial and the younger generation, Gen Z, here in the US or even around the world, like friends that I have like all over places, some of the issues that you've brought up are like the key issues. It's like economic prosperity, climate crisis. I think this is almost a generational rift. It's like we have an
absolutely.
And the younger generation.
No, because with my age, you could say, okay, I don't have much left, but my children, for them, this is their future, so they take it much more seriously.
Absolutely. Wow. Thank you so much. This has been like really like invigorating to kind of hear your perspective and to show that we're so much more connected than we think we are.
Absolutely.
Where can viewers like read some of your work or connect with you online?
Well, I mean, I have Twitter account. It's Vali_Nasr. I'm on Facebook. Those are ways. And then, if you Google what I've written, it all shows up. Books on Amazon. You could Google, I'm now sort of connected that way. It's much easier.
Super. Wow. Well, thank you so much, Professor Nasr. This has been actually a delight.
Thank you.
To pick your brain and see the future of the region and Islam in the context of how our world is being shaped. Thank you so much, and I hope to continue.
Thanks for inviting me.
Absolutely.